Week 29 Overview Scramble for Empire. Students at all levels will be reading about Africa this week. Europe was fully committed to the scramble for Africa, but Americans had other priorities in the 1870s. America was still recovering from the Civil War, stabilizing its currency, fighting Indians in the West. The nation spent months just trying to pick a president. Ulysses S. Grant had served 2 terms, but scandals plagued his administration. The Republicans were divided before the election of 1876. Some wanted Grant to run a 3rd time, others wanted a fresh face. They finally decided on an earnest Christian, Rutherford B. Hayes, as a compromise candidate. As Election Day neared, things didn't look so good for the Republicans. Democrat Samuel J. Tilden was clearly in the lead. But politics is a funny business. 4 states couldn't figure out who deserved their electoral votes, and the choice of the next president wound up in Congress's hands. In the Compromise of 1877, they cut a deal that gave the White House to the Republicans, but ended Reconstruction forever. The new president, Rutherford B. Hayes, had a difficult job, which he handled with grace. He was a sincere Christian who tried to help those who were oppressed in America, Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and blacks, but he made little headway. He vetoed some popular bills and wound up with a single term in office. If you recall the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000, you can appreciate the mess of 1876. After the votes were cast on Election Day, 4 different states submitted 2 different sets of returns. The Republicans said Republicans had won each state, and the Democrats said that Democrats had won. On December 6th, when the Electoral College met to vote, the votes of Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon were still in dispute. If you only counted the undisputed votes, Rutherford B. Hayes had 165 votes, and Tilden had 184, which was 1 vote short of a majority. According to the Constitution, if no candidate for president gets a majority of electoral votes, the matter goes to the House of Representatives. When the going gets tough, Congress creates a committee. So, in January 1877, Congress set up a 15-member electoral commission to decide the matter. The debates got heated. Republicans and Democrats both threatened to seize the government by force if their candidate lost. Inauguration Day was getting closer and closer with no resolution in sight. In the end, the Southern Democrats tipped the scales. They offered to let the Republican win if he promised to end Reconstruction, pulling all federal troops out of the Southern capitals. Now, that could be a problem because those federal troops were the only guarantee that freedmen could vote and participate in the government of their state. But the Democrats promised to respect the political rights of all black citizens, so the Republicans agreed to the Compromise of 1877 3 days before Inauguration Day, and Rutherford B. Hayes was sworn in as America's 19th president. The new first family moved into the White House. They set a good example for the nation, much like Queen Victoria and her royal family in Britain. Rutherford started each day with morning prayers and ended the day with music and singing. First Lady Lucy Hayes was noted for her modest, simple hospitality. She held public receptions almost every evening and welcomed every visitor to the White House. The Hayeses believed in temperance and banned all alcohol at official functions, to the dismay of some visiting dignitaries. They weren't killjoys, though. They introduced the annual Easter egg roll for children on the White House lawn. As president, Hayes faced major problems. Money was a problem. Isn't it always? In this case, it was the currency itself that became controversial. Now, this might sound odd to modern ears, but it's an old problem. Ancient, really. Governments began standardizing currency thousands of years ago. That's why Jesus could hold up a coin and ask whose image was on it. Gold and silver have been the primary precious metals. Now and then, especially in wartime, governments try to use paper for money. It's really no better than a great big IOU. The Confederate government printed millions of paper dollars, which all became worthless after they lost. The Union printed paper money too, but it was all supposed to be backed up by money in the bank. Real money, which meant gold and silver bars. By 1878, every American paper dollar was backed up by an equal amount of gold and silver in the Treasury. Any citizen, at any time, could redeem a, quote, greenback for gold or for silver. But there was a problem with that. After big mineral strikes out west, there was relatively more silver than gold, so the value of silver began to drop. Everybody started demanding gold instead of silver, but paying in silver instead of gold. The supplies of gold in the Treasury went down. Congress tried to fix that problem by passing a law, which Hayes vetoed. Congress overrode the veto and required the government to buy up the excess silver in mint coins, which would then be issued slowly so the value didn't drop. A year later, Congress changed its mind. The government stopped buying up silver and required all paper money to be backed by gold alone. That hurt farmers and small businesses all over the country, and it set the stage for the rise of populism, which we'll be studying in week 34. Hayes didn't make himself popular with the little people when he vetoed that Currency Act, and he compounded the problem by vetoing another bill to keep Chinese immigrants out of the country. China had been sending workers across the Pacific in large numbers since the Transcontinental Railroad had been started in the 1860s. The Chinese worked hard for low wages, and that fueled a new form of racism. Many Americans tended to despise the black people and feared red Indians, but poor whites out west began to fear that these Orientals would take away their jobs. Jealousy and resentment fueled the drive to keep the Chinese out, which resulted in a new act of Congress. Hayes vetoed the bill banning Chinese immigrants. He negotiated a treaty with China to limit immigration instead. That wasn't good enough for his opponents, however, so his political future was limited. Hayes didn't run for a second term. The Republicans nominated his friend, James A. Garfield, who won the election of 1880. Garfield was a self-made man, the last president to have been born in a log cabin. Garfield, like Hayes, was a reformer who wanted to root out political corruption. We'll never know what Garfield might have done, however, because he was shot by an assassin after 1 month in office. He didn't die immediately, but the doctors couldn't get the bullet out of his back. He lay in bed for 80 days, relatively cheerful but unable to carry out the duties of his office. Vice President Chester A. Arthur took off the presidency when Garfield finally died. Meanwhile, an ocean away, all Europe was scrambling to outdo each other in the takeover of Africa, the last big blank spot on the map. By the middle of the 19th century, Europeans had conquered and then lost South and Central America, colonized North America and Australia, and subjugated Asia, but Africa hadn't even been thoroughly explored yet. Africa seemed impenetrable. Wild beasts, poisonous snakes, and native tribes made exploration dangerous. There were no great civilizations south of the Sahara to build roads through the jungles, and the rivers were largely inaccessible. During the 1600s and 1700s, Europeans came to Africa with rum that they traded for kidnapped humans, who were shipped across the Atlantic to sugar plantations in the Americas. In the triangle trade, African slaves grew American sugar that made European rum that paid for slaves. Britain banned the slave trade in 1807 and outlawed slavery throughout most of the British Empire in 1834. That left the African slave trade to less scrupulous Europeans, like the Portuguese, who traded guns for human beings. Earlier this year, we studied some missionaries to Africa who wanted to change all that. David Livingstone braved jungles and deserts for the sake of the gospel, opening up much of southern Africa to British influence for the first time. English evangelicals soon caught this vision of bringing Christ to the African natives. Africa was more than a mission field, though. Once Europeans made their way into the interior, they discovered Africa had much more than slaves to offer. There were raw materials and mineral wealth that could fuel an industrial economy. Africa's resources could alter Europe's balance of power. So once any European power started claiming territory there, the rest felt they had to jump in. It was England that started the scramble for Africa, and it began with the Suez Canal in Egypt. France and Egypt had pooled their resources to build this canal, which cut 6,000 miles off a voyage from Europe to India. For several decades, Egypt had been trying to modernize and had borrowed Western money to build railroads, dams, and a modern army which enabled Egypt to break away from rule by the Turks of the Ottoman Empire. The Egyptian rulers got into financial trouble in 1875, though, so British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli unilaterally bought up controlling interest in the canal, using British funds. Egypt's new government was so shaky it looked like it might default on its loans, so Britain quietly took over the Egyptian government in 1882. Now, there were other seafaring nations that wanted access to the Suez Canal, too. They reacted quickly to the British takeover. King Leopold II of Belgium claimed a huge area around the Congo River in the middle of Africa, for himself as a personal possession, not for his country. France grabbed lands in western Africa, while Portugal and Spain turned their trading posts on the east and west coasts into sizable colonies. Italy and Germany had just come onto the scene as European powers, as we learned last unit. They were latecomers, but they still jumped into the scramble. Germany managed to acquire substantial territory. Italy had more trouble. They went after the ancient kingdom of Abyssinia, which we know as Ethiopia, but the Ethiopians fought back. Ethiopia maintained its independence, as did the little nation of Liberia, which had been colonized by freed slaves from the United States. The rest of Africa fell under European rule. America didn't join the scramble. There was way too much to be done back home in the years after the Civil War. That saved the United States from some of the worst aspects of imperialism. But, as we've seen, America was not free from the taint of racial superiority. People who wanted to treat blacks and Indians and Chinese people well were swimming against the cultural tide, and countercultural Christians like Rutherford B. Hayes suffered for it.